All right. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'd like to thank Rebecca for allowing me to zoom in. It saved me around 11 hours of driving time. I'm located all the way in far western Kentucky at the University of Kentucky's research station in Princeton, Kentucky. And it's a pleasure to be with you guys tonight. I'm I'm going to talk about some strategies for improving hay quality, and we've got some challenges with hay quality in Kentucky, and I'm going to show you just a little bit of data from the hay contest from this season, but and then talk a little bit about things that we can do to improve forage quality. Let's see here. All right, I always like to start out and talk just a little bit about what hay quality means. And there's lots of different ways that we try to quantify hay quality. If you've ever turned in a report for a hay quality sample, you'll see all kinds of terms on there like acid detergent fiber, and crude protein, and neutral detergent fiber, and in vitro true digestibility. And they're all trying to get at this idea of what hay quality means. And really kind of in the big picture, what hay quality is the ability of that forage to produce a desired animal response. And that's kind of a moving target, right? So the what hay quality hay is for a brood cow is going to be different than what it is for a dairy cow or even for a pleasure horse. So understanding what the requirements of each one of these different animal classes are is really important in determining what hay quality means to you on your farm. And this is, I'm not going to go through all these numbers, but this is just showing you the variation in what hay quality is for different, or what the animal requirements are for different classes of animals. If we look, for example, at crude protein, it ranges from 7% up to 13 or 14%, depending on the animal class. And same thing with total digestible nutrients. We see a range of 50 to 70%, depending on the animal class. Even within an animal class, if we look at the requirements of a dry beef cow, so one that's gestating with a calf in her belly, but she's not lactating, that's when her requirements are going to be the lowest, 7 to 8%. When she's actively lactating, her crude protein requirement is going to be up to in the range of 10 to 12%. Same thing for TDN. So when she's dry, her TDN requirement is going to be as low as 50% versus 60% when she's actively lactating. So understanding what animal class you're working with and what stage of the production cycle that animal is in is really important in determining whether that hay quality will meet the nutritional requirements of that animal. So it's really important to define what level of hay quality you need on your operation. Now, when we evaluate hay, there's several different ways to go about that. And the first one is what I call sensory analysis. And as the name implies, it's when we look at that hay and we kind of make an assessment of whether it's good hay or bad hay. So we touch it and we feel it and we smell it, and we look at it and we try to evaluate it. And oftentimes we'll use a hay card, a hay scoring card that looks something like this. And we'll look at things like maturity. Are there seed heads present? We'll look at, is it leafy or does it have a lot of stems in it? Is it green or brown? Does it smell good or does it have kind of a musty or moldy smell to it, which means it could have been put up when it was a little bit too wet? And does it have any foreign material in it? And in 2021, our research station was hit by a tornado. That's our main building in the background. And it gave me a whole new appreciation for foreign material. I spent the whole winter leading a crew, walking through hay fields and pastures and row crop fields, picking up pieces of building debris. So being free of foreign material is really important for high quality hay. Now, what this method does, a sensory method, it allows us to say, well, maybe this hay lot is better than this hay lot, but it doesn't quantify anything. It doesn't quantify the nutritional value of that hay. So it's hard to say that hay lot A has 12% crude protein and hay lot B has 7% crude protein. I may be able to say A is better than B, but I can't quantify the nutritional differences. So I can't use this type of analysis to say, yes, this hay is going to meet the nutritional requirements of the livestock that I'm feeding it to. And that's kind of where laboratory analysis comes in. And this is usually what we recommend for people to do. And it actually quantifies or it measures different things in the hay. And then we can compare these to the nutritional requirements of the animal and say, yes, this hay is going to meet the nutritional requirements, or no, it's not going to meet the nutritional requirements. And I'll need to supplement it in order to keep my animals from losing weight during the winter months when she's lactating with a calf by her side. For the majority of samples analyzed in the United States, about 90% of the samples are analyzed with a procedure called near-infrared spectroscopy. And that's this little, if you look at this photograph of me holding up the little cell, this machine in the background is a near-infrared spectrophotometer. So in a nutshell, what it does is I put this little disc of forage in there. So I grind the hay up, dry it and grind it and stick it in this little cell. And I put that cell in that near-infrared spectrophotometer. It shines the light that's in the near-infrared spectrum, and it measures what gets absorbed and what gets reflected back. And from that, we can develop equations to predict all these different parameters that you'll see on a forage test. It's very accurate, it's very rapid, and it's very precise. So it's a great method of analysis. And again, about 90% of the samples in the United States get analyzed with near-infrared spectroscopy. So we're quantifying with the laboratory method the nutritional value of the hay, and that allows us to say, yes, it's going to meet the requirements of the animal, or no, it is not going to meet the requirements of the animal. And I know you guys have done a lot of this in the Eastern Kentucky hay contest, but getting a good hay sample is really critical. If that hay sample does not represent the hay being fed to the animal accurately, then your results are not worth a whole lot. So it's really important to get a good hay sample. And tonight I'm not going to go through this because most of you know how to do this. I know Rebecca knows how to do this very well. I will just say that we do have a really nice hay sampling fact sheet, and it just goes through the key points to remember when collecting that sample. And one of the most important ones, if you look at the picture on the right, is that we want to submit a sample that's large enough to represent the hay lot, but small enough so that the lab will grind the entire sample. If they don't grind the entire sample, you'll notice on the bottom of this picture, there's a lot of fine particles. And in many cases, those fine particles contain the most nutritious part of that hay. If they just reach in this bag and grab a sample, generally they'll get the more coarse material, which tends to be lower in forage quality. So you can get this publication by asking Rebecca, number one, or simply Googling UKY AGR 257 or scanning that QR code in the upper right-hand corner. I just want to show you a little bit of data from the regional hay contest this year. And this is averaged over the 3 contests that we held this year. So there was one in Eastern Kentucky. That's our granddad of all the hay contests. It's the biggest one. And Rebecca, I think, collected the most samples of any county in Eastern Kentucky. And then we have Central Kentucky, and then we have another hay contest in South Central Kentucky. And the data that I'm going to show you is averaged over all 3 contests. So I'm going to show you just two parameters, and these are the 2 parameters that we balance rations for, and they're crude protein and energy. So we'll start out with crude protein. And crude protein is an estimate of the protein content of the feed or forage. And we call it crude because we're not actually measuring protein, but we're measuring the total nitrogen in that forage sample. And then we multiply by 6.25 to come up with a value for crude protein. And this was the results for the 3 hay contests this year. This is for crude protein, and this is the percentage on your y-axis. On the x-axis or the bottom are the different hay categories. So we had grass hay, we had baleage, we had some legume hay, mixed hay, which would be grass and legume, and then an average over all the categories. On this graph, we have three dotted lines. The top dotted line represents a growing animal. So this is a 450-pound steer that's actively growing. That is that steer's crude protein requirement. And then we have a lactating cow. So that will be a cow with a calf by her side, actively producing milk to feed that calf. And that will be the middle line. And then the bottom line is a dry cow. That's a dry cow that's gestating. So she's pregnant, but she's not producing any milk. And that's going to be the animal that has the lowest crude protein requirement. One other thing I want to point out is on the bars, there's a number. It says N equals. That's how many samples were in each one of these categories. So the majority of the samples were in either the grass hay 528 or the mixed hay. We had about 55 samples in legume hay, which would include alfalfa and clover. And then baleage, we had about 100 samples. Total, we had about 1,127 samples. What I want you to take away from this graph is that crude protein was pretty good in all of our samples. If we look at all of our samples, most of the samples met the crude protein requirement. Actually, all the samples on average met the crude protein requirement of a lactating cow. Now, remember, it is an average. So an average means there's some samples above that requirement and some below it. But on average, our crude protein was pretty good. And that's normally what we find in grassland ecosystems. So when we look at forage and hay, usually crude protein is pretty sufficient. Sometimes we'll get samples with low crude protein, but generally speaking, it's pretty sufficient. And that's kind of what this graph shows. So this is the same categories on the bottom, and then this is the samples that would meet the protein requirement of a lactating beef cow. And that's the percent of samples on the y-axis. So of the grass hay category, about almost 80% of the samples would meet the nutrient requirements of the crude protein requirements of a lactating brood cow. All of our samples for baleage, legume hay, and mixed hay came very close to meeting the crude protein requirements. And on average, over 80% of the samples in the 3 hay contest met the crude protein requirement of a lactating brood cow. The next parameter I wanted to look at was total digestible nutrients, and this is an estimation of energy in the hay. And so we balance a ration for crude protein and for energy. So this was the average. This was an estimation of the energy in the hay. And we estimate this using a value called acid detergent fiber. You'll commonly see acid detergent fiber on your forage analysis. And the way we calculate total digestible nutrients is we have a formula that based on acid detergent fiber, we plug that acid detergent fiber into the equation, and it gives us an estimate of the energy in that hay, or the total digestible nutrients. So the graph is set up in a similar manner. We've got our hay categories in the bottom, got our bars for each category, and then instead of crude protein on the y-axis, we have total digestible nutrients. What I want you to notice is that, and then we, of course, have the requirements for a growing animal. That's the top dotted line. The middle dotted line is a lactating brood cow, and then a dry cow. Now, as far as meeting the energy requirements of a dry cow, all of our sample classes did that successfully on average. When we start to look at the requirements of a lactating brood cow, so that's a calf by her side actively producing milk, we can see that on average, our grass in our mixed hay did not meet the nutrient requirements of that lactating brood cow. And on average, our hay samples on average over all the categories did not meet the requirements of a lactating brood cow. So the point that I want to make is that usually crude protein is sufficient, but where we really fall short at is with energy in these samples. And this is what this graph shows. This is the percent of samples that would meet the energy requirements of a lactating beef cow. So again, when we look at grass hay, it's really pretty stunning that only about 14% of the hay samples in the contest this year would meet the energy requirements of lactating brood cow. In mixed hay was a little bit higher up, around 20% or so. Legume and baleage were better, but not complete, not 100%. The point that I want to make is that it's important to know both the crude protein and the energy requirement so that we can supplement samples of hay with an adequate supplement to make sure that we're meeting the energy needs of a lactating brood cow. If we don't do that, then those animals will milk condition off themselves. So they're producing milk, they're using fat that has been deposited on their body to produce that milk, and to and over time they'll lose body condition score. The number one factor impacting rebreeding in beef cow herds is body condition score at calving. So if we produce a lot of thin cows by feeding poor quality hay, then we're going to reduce the reproductive efficiency of our herd. Okay, so that was just kind of a quick overview of the results from the forage contest. What I really want to talk about tonight is factors impacting hay quality. Some we can control, some we can't control, but there's a couple key ones that I really want to focus in on tonight and talk about how we can manage those factors to improve the quality of hay that we're producing. So let me go through some of the factors. And the first one is species. So generally, legumes like clover and alfalfa and lespedeza will generally tend to be higher in forage quality than grasses. The life cycle of plants, so annuals, something like an annual ryegrass or a small grain in the vegetative state, or summer annual like a sorghum Sudan grass that hasn't got out of control, are going to tend to be higher in quality than perennials. Cool season grasses tend to be higher in forage quality and higher in crude protein than warm season grasses. Temperature negatively impacts forage quality. So as temperature increases, we tend to increase the amount of lignin, which is a structural compound in the plant. And as the lignin goes up, digestibility of that plant fiber goes down. So as temperature increases, we tend to decrease the forage quality or the digestibility of forage plants. Fertilization can impact forage quality, mostly crude protein, but its biggest impact is going to be on yield or biomass production of that plant. And we'll talk more about fertilization in a minute. And then the time of day. So in late afternoon, after that plant has actively been undergoing photosynthesis all day long, capturing sunlight, turning it into sugars and carbohydrates through photosynthesis, that's when we're going to have the highest concentrations of sugars in that plant. Now, the question becomes is, should we wait until late afternoon to cut our hay to optimize that concentration of sugars in the plant? In our climate, I would say no. And the reason why is that we're really scrapping for enough drying days to get that first cutting made, especially in spring. So we need to cut to maximize drying days. And usually that's going to be about 10 in the morning after the dew gets off of that forage crop. We need to go ahead and cut it to maximize our drying time. Now, if I was in the Pacific Northwest and I was under irrigation and I could cut it and be assured that I would have 3 days to cure that forage out, then I would say, yeah, go ahead and cut it in late afternoon to maximize sugar concentration, but not in the humid eastern United States. Stage of maturity at harvest is important. Generally, plants that are in the vegetative state are going to be higher in forage quality than the reproductive state. And then harvesting conditions. So is it going to rain? If it rains, when does that rain come? If it comes immediately after we cut it, then the damage will be less than if it rains on it right before it's almost dry enough to bale. Also, leaf loss and legumes can play a major role in forage quality losses. And then how we store that hay is going to impact forage quality. So if it's outside, sitting in the weather on the ground in a low depression, it's going to wick a bunch of water up and it's going to be much lower in forage quality than hay that was stuck in a barn that's covered, that we don't have a lot of ground contact with. That's going to be much higher in forage quality by the time we feed it. There's three things I want to focus in on tonight, and those three things are well, I'll talk a little bit about species, the importance of species, and then talk a little bit about fertilization, and then focus in on stage of maturity at harvest, when we're cutting that hay. So I just want to talk about legumes, and I don't think we concentrate enough on getting and maintaining legumes in forage stands, whether it's pastures or hay fields. Legumes have a superpower, and that superpower is what we call nitrogen fixation. Legumes actively fix nitrogen from the air. The air we're breathing right now, 78% nitrogen gas, N2 gas, but it's not available to the plant. The legumes form a symbiotic relationship with rhizobium bacteria. They infect the roots of the legume plant and form nodules. And then those bacteria take that nitrogen gas from the air and convert it into a plant available form that they share with the legume plant. And after photosynthesis, nitrogen fixation is the second most important biochemical process on Earth. And that's why we often refer to legumes as keystone species. They're that important species in grassland ecosystems because they're able to capture nitrogen from the air and bring it into that grazing system where it can be cycled within that grazing system and eventually shared with the grass plant through deposition of dung and urine, and some direct release of nitrogen into the soil from the legume plant. So there's a lot of benefits of legume. They improve soil fertility and structure. They reduce water and air pollution because we're not having to apply a synthetic nitrogen fertilizer or make that synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. When we make a synthetic nitrogen fertilizer through the Haber-Bosch process, we need an energy source, and usually we're consuming natural gas to make that nitrogen source. They improve the yield of grasslands and also the forage quality and animal performance of animals that are grazing a grass legume mix are generally going to be higher than animals grazing straight grass mixture. Really important for us in Kentucky and other transition zone states. So those are states that aren't in the South and aren't in the North. Include states like Kentucky, Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Missouri. Those are what we call our transition zone states. And the dominant grass species in those states is tall fescue. And tall fescue is infected with a toxic endophyte. And that toxic endophyte results in lower animal performance. When we add legumes into tall fescue stands, we can mitigate the negative impact of tall fescue toxicosis. All right, so overall, they improve the economic and environmental sustainability of forage livestock systems. The reason I'm spending a little bit of time on this slide is I want you to understand that legumes are an important part of grassland ecosystems and an important part of hay production systems, in that we really need to be thinking about ways or strategies that we can get and maintain legumes in hay fields to improve forage quality. And probably one of the easiest ways to do that is to frost seed clover on and make sure we do that on a regular basis. So frost seeding is simply broadcasting that seed on the soil surface. We do that in late winter or very early spring. We're past the optimal time now. The optimal time would be starting around the first or second week of February through early March, when we still have active freezing and thawing cycles that causes the soil to crack and for that seed to enter that soil surface. And that heaving and freezing and thawing of the soil is what incorporates that legume seed into the soil surface. Works best with red and white clover, not as well with grasses and with alfalfa. So a general recommendation is 6 to 8 pounds of red clover or 1 to 2 pounds of ladino clover. And we can also add 10 to 15 pounds of annual lespedeza on hay fields or pastures that are lower in fertility. Annual lespedeza was a legume that was used a lot 60 or 70 years ago, before we had ready access to lime and fertilizer. So if you're renting a farm or you have a hay field and you can't afford to put fertilizer on it, maybe adding a little bit of annual lespedeza could be a benefit. If your soil fertility is good, I would concentrate primarily on red and white clover. And I know you're all sitting there and saying, well, I wish I would have saw this presentation about a month and a half ago so I could have frost seeded clover. And that would have been good. So now, if you still want to try some clover this spring, then you really need to no-till it into your hay fields and pastures at this point in time. And that no-tilling it in allows you to get soil to seed contact immediately. So we're not counting on that freezing and thawing to incorporate that seed. We have a really nice publication on frost seeding, and it kind of goes through and it just tells you in bullet form things to remember to help you have more success with frost seeding. And again, Rebecca can get that, or you can actually scan that QR code and bring that publication up online. I just want to take a minute and show you a study that we did several years ago, and it was evaluating the use of GPS guidance for frost seeding clover and pastures. And so our goal was to see if we could increase the uniformity of seed distribution when we use a small portable GPS unit. So we used a Raven Cruiser 2 GPS unit. And what we did in the study is we initiated guidance, and then we did something really high tech. So we're recording where we're going, but we covered it up so the operator couldn't use it. And then we had the operator overseed 4 pastures that ranged in size from 6 to 10 acres. And I gave him instructions to drive at a certain speed and 30 feet apart and do the best job he could do. And so we recorded where he went. And then we did the same thing again. We initiated guidance, but we allowed them to use the guidance of the GPS to see where they'd been. And this was the results. Pretty amazing. So both operators, we had 2 different operators. We did it in 2019 and 2021. The first year we did it, the first operator with no guidance had a 50% overlap. So in the second year, the driver was a little bit better, but she still had a 21% overlap. Averaged over the 2 years, the operators had a 35% overlap. So instead of having misses, they were more concerned with not having misses, which means they drove closer together when they didn't have guidance. And that resulted in an overlap of around 35%. Now, when they use guidance, they reduced that overlap to about 3%. So you can see how one of these small GPS units could be really beneficial for frost seeding in pastures to reduce the amount of overlap that we have. These units will pay for themselves in about 200 acres of frost seeding. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about soil fertility and hay quality. And soil fertility directly impacts stand productivity and persistence. So soil fertility is really important in hay production systems, not necessarily because it's a big driver of hay quality, but it's a driver of biomass production and persistence of desired forage species. So if we don't have good soil fertility, getting clover to persist and orchard grass to persist in pastures is much, much harder. So we want to make sure that we have good forage quality just for that sheer productivity of the stand and the persistence of that stand. Now, it can directly impact forage quality, and a good example is crude protein. So as we increase nitrogen fertilization in stands, we tend to increase crude protein. That's kind of what this first graph shows here. So generally, as nitrogen rate increased on the bottom axis from 0 to 400 pounds per acre per year, we saw an increase in crude protein. Now, fiber, this is neutral detergent fiber and in vitro true digestibility, were less impacted by increases in nitrogen fertilization. So again, crude protein is going to be the most sensitive, but the most important thing is that we're creating an environment to keep desirable forage species in that stand. And that's really important for improved legumes like red and white clover. So we can directly impact forage quality, not necessarily by um, soil fertility, but by making an environment that allows legumes to persist within that stand. And when we do that, we're going to increase forage quality indirectly by having a greater percentage of legumes in our hay. Okay, we'll talk just a little bit about soil sampling in pastures. And soil testing is important, and I know Rebecca drives this home at every extension meeting, and I just wanted to reinforce that. Soil testing quantifies nutrients in the soil. It quantifies soil pH, which is really important. It quantifies phosphorus and potassium. We do not measure nitrogen in the soil. It's a very mobile nutrient, so we don't measure that. We make that recommendation based on previous yield trials. It's hard to manage something we don't measure. So this soil sampling provides that baseline data that allows us to start to manage an active soil fertility program for our hayfields. And it's even more important when fertilizer is very high in price because it allows us to target applications. So we're putting on just what we need, not more, but just the right amount. And we're making sure that we're not under applying other nutrients. You know, it hurts my heart when I see people apply a triple 19 or 10-10-10 to hayfields and pastures, because I can tell you from experience that they're not putting on the right ratio of nutrients to meet the needs of that forage stand. And I'll show you in a minute nutrients contained in hay. Got a really nice publication on soil sampling, and again, it's not rocket science. It's just reminding you of good practices so that you get a good soil sample. The results of your soil test are only as good as that sample represents that pasture. So if you want to get a copy of this, again, you can either go online and Google UKY AGR 252, scan this QR code, or simply ask Rebecca for a copy before you go home tonight. I want to talk about a little bit about lime. Soil acidity is still a major factor limiting forage production, not just in Kentucky, but the whole southeastern United States. Generally, when we don't do anything with the soil, we tend to reduce over time. Soil acidity tends to increase, or our soil pH tends to go down. And soil acidity, having soil low pH in our pastures, or a lot of soil acidity, reduces nutrient availability of all the nutrients in the soil, and it also reduces nitrogen fixation in legumes. And this is just a chart showing that. So we go from very acidic on the left to very alkaline on the right. And what I want you to notice is that when we're in that desired pH range, which is going to be between 6 and 7 for most pastures and hayfields, that's when all of our nutrients are the most plant available. Each one of these bands, the wider the band is on here, the more plant available that nutrient is. So at this range of 6 to 7, all of our major plant nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, are all going to be the most plant available. Why am I showing you this? I'm showing you this because I want you to understand that if you get your soil test back and it says you need lime, then lime is going to be your best buy, because when we put lime on, we not only neutralize soil acidity, but we make all these other nutrients more plant available in the soil. So it's your best buy in terms of adjusting soil fertility. So liming neutralizes soil acidity, also supplies calcium and magnesium. These are just some general guidelines, but in general, if you're between 6 and 6.4 for mixed stands of grass and clover, you're going to be in pretty good shape. As you approach 6, then you should start to think about applying a little bit of lime to that pasture. I did want to show you just a little bit of data. We did a study several years ago on a product called ProCal. And ProCal is very aggressively marketed in social media like Facebook. And it makes promises of raising pH fast and cheaper than lime. And it has a lot of client testimonials. And that's always a red flag for me when a company is selling a product and they have no hard data and a lot of testimonials. You've got to really think twice about whether what they're promising you is true or not. So I did a field study with my colleague Edwin Ritchie here at the research station, and we evaluated ProCal, which is actually liquid calcium, agricultural limestone that you would get from a quarry, or pelleted limestone that you can buy at a store or at a farm supply. And we evaluated the efficacy of these materials for changing the pH of the soil. We did this at not just one location. This was a replicated study that we did at 16 different locations in the state. And as you can see, we had a couple locations in Carter and Lewis County and Fleming County, so pretty close to you all. This was the initial soil pH. So these were our treatments. We had a control treatment that got no limestone. We had a liquid calcium treatment. That's the advanced cal, or the ProCal. And then we had a pelleted limestone, and then we had just the normal agricultural limestone that you would get from the quarry. So at the beginning of the study, before we applied any of these treatments, there was no difference. The A's on top of the bars means there's no statistical difference. So all the fields were equal, and this is averaged over all 16 sites. So this is 12 months after application. The first thing I want you to notice is that the control and the liquid calcium are not different. What that means is the liquid calcium did not increase soil pH compared to the control that received nothing at all. Second thing I want you to notice is that the pelleted limestone and the ag limestone worked equally well. So they increased the pH unit on average over these 16 locations by about 3/4 of a unit in 12 months. So they're working, and they're working well. Now, the difference between the pelleted limestone and the ag limestone, they're similar products, except the pelleted limestone is actually ag limestone that's been pelletized, and it costs a lot more than ag limestone. Your best buy for neutralizing soil acidity in pastures would be agricultural limestone. Okay, I just want to mention that when you get your soil test back, you'll have a recommendation for phosphorus and potassium, and it's important to apply that according to the soil test. Again, lime gets first billing, but P and K are also important. And what I want you to look at is that we don't have to put a ton of fertilizer on hay fields and pastures, but we want to maintain that soil test value in the medium range. And if you look at these graphs, on the y-axis here is a relative yield. And then we have either soil test phosphorus or soil test potassium. What I want you to notice is that when we're in the medium range, we're doing pretty good in terms of our relative yield. We're coming close to 100% of our relative yield. So if we are able to maintain soil test phosphorus and potassium in this medium range, medium plus, high minus would be ideal, then we're meeting the needs of that plant and achieving close to 100% relative yield. No need for us to be in the high or very high range, but we definitely want to be in that solid medium range, and then we're not going to be holding yield back in our hay fields and pastures. Okay, and then we want to make sure we monitor soil fertility really close in hay fields and pastures. And I can almost always tell you when somebody brings me a soil test and shows me their soil test, I can tell you whether it's a hay field or not, because normally we're going to be short on potassium, or our potassium value is going to be low in that hay field. And hay removes a lot of nutrients. So when we're taking hay off of that field, we're also transporting nutrients out of that hay field. And it's very important that we apply fertilizer according to soil test to maintain those nutrient levels. We don't want that soil test level to drop below about a medium or a medium plus value. What I want you to notice here, for example, is the amount of nutrients removed by different crops. If we look at orchard grass, for example, we're removing around 36 pounds of nitrogen in every ton of orchard grass hay produced. We're removing about 15 pounds of phosphorus, SP2O5, and about 55 pounds of K2O. So if we have a good year, we're removing 45 pounds of phosphorus per acre, and we're removing, 150 to 160 or 170 pounds of K2O with a yield of 3 tons of orchard grass per acre. You can make hay and for several years without applying any fertilizer, but over time you start to draw soil test levels down, especially for phosphorus and potassium. And as that happens, the productivity of your stand decreases. The first call that I went on when I moved to Kentucky in 2017 was a Bermuda grass hay producer in Western Kentucky. And he says, I don't know what's happening. My yields have just been getting lower and lower and lower. And when we sat down and looked at his soil test values, he had drawn potash or potassium down to very low levels, and that was limiting his overall production. I want to show you just a little bit of fertilization data. It's kind of an interesting study that we've been working on for several years here at the research station in Princeton, and it's a late fall nitrogen application. And I know you all are saying this guy has completely lost his mind. Why would you be putting nitrogen on in the late fall? Let me tell you just a little bit about this practice. Fall nitrogen application is a pretty standard recommendation in turfgrass industry. And they put it on in late fall, so not August or September, but closer to Thanksgiving, late November, very early December. And that fall nitrogen actually gets that plant ready to grow that following spring. We took a tall fescue hayfield at the research station in Princeton, and we applied some different applications of fall nitrogen. So plots received nitrogen as urea in one of 3 treatment groups. We had a fall applied nitrogen, and that was in the first week of December. We had a spring, same amount of nitrogen applied in the spring, and then we had a split application where we applied all the treatments in both the fall and the spring, all possible combinations. And the nitrogen values were 0, 40, or 80 pounds of nitrogen applied in the fall. So we had no nitrogen up to 80 pounds applied in the fall. And then in the spring, we had 0, 40, 80, or 120 pounds of nitrogen applied, and then all possible combinations of these two. And this was the results. So the solid line is fall applied nitrogen only. So that's 0, 40, and 80 pounds. And then spring applied nitrogen is the dotted line, and that was 0, 40, 80, and 120 pounds of nitrogen. What I want you to notice is that when I applied the nitrogen in the fall, 80 pounds of nitrogen was equivalent to 100 to 120 pounds of nitrogen applied in the spring. Pretty interesting data. So we need to really do this study again. We've done it 2 years. We need to really confirm this. But applying late fall nitrogen, you think it would be lost from the system, but it's not actually. If you have a good stand of tall fescue, that tall fescue, even around Thanksgiving, is still actively growing. It's just not producing a lot of biomass. So its root system kind of sequesters that nitrogen or takes that nitrogen up and gets that plant ready to grow. We know that applying nitrogen in the fall is going to increase tiller numbers. So those little stems coming out of a clump of tall fescue. And it's going to get that stand off to an earlier start in the spring. Okay. I want to talk about stage of maturity at harvest. So we talked about species and we talked about fertilization, but the single most important factor impacting forage quality, and this is one that you have control over is going to be stage of maturity and harvest. This is the most important factor impacting forage quality. And that's what this graph shows. So if I look at this graph, this is moving from a leafy vegetative plant to a plant that's in the reproductive stages or blooming and producing seed. And as we increase, our biomass increases and is optimized when that plant is at full bloom. However, our forage quality, the digestibility of that plant in the rumen of the animal, and the amount of that forage the animal can eat, both decrease as that plant moves from a vegetative stage to a full bloom stage. And our best compromise between yield and forage quality is going to be when that grass plant is at the late boot or early head stage, and that legume plant is early to mid bloom stage. That's when we're going to get a pretty good yield and a pretty good quality of forage. Now, the closer we get to harvesting our hay on Independence Day, then our yield is going to be high, but our forage quality is going to be quite low. Starts when we start to see hay quality of 7% crude protein and 50 or 52% TDN as we approach a very late harvested hay. That's getting into late June, mid to late June. The point of this graph is that we really need to avoid harvesting too late. If there's one thing that you can do that you have control over, is the stage of maturity that we harvest our forage at. And this is just kind of showing some data. This is from a publication on quality hay production by Dr. Lacefield, Henning, and Collins. And this was a study that was done. This is the effective stage of maturity of tall fescue hay on forage quality and animal gain. If we look at crude protein, when we're at the late boot stage, so that's when the optimal time is to harvest that hay, we're at almost 14% crude protein. By the time seed is actively forming, we're down to around 7.5% crude protein. If we look at digestibility of that fiber in the rumen of the animal, at late boot stage, 68% digestible and 56% when seed's forming, so a significant decrease in digestibility. If we look at dry matter intake, so that's the amount of forage that animal can eat, we go from 13 pounds per day down to 8.6 pounds. So think about it real quick. So if I have a really poor quality forage, it's lower in nutritional value, it's less digestible in the rumen, and the animals can eat less of it. So it's kind of like a double whammy. It's really low in quality, and I can't eat enough of it to get what I need. And when we look at that translated into performance of these steers in this study, at late boot stage, hay harvested at late boot stage had about 1.4 pounds of average daily gain versus 0.42 pounds when seed's forming. If you think about one slide when you drive home tonight, think about this slide, because this is really the essence of how important it is to harvest your hay at the proper growth stage. So the question becomes, and this is new information, guys, the question becomes, why don't we harvest at the right growth stage? And there's lots of reasons. A lot of us work off the farm, so work a public job, and when somebody's writing you a paycheck, it's pretty important you show up to work on a regular basis. Cattle and forage are often a secondary enterprise. This was very prevalent on tobacco operations. Tobacco is a cash crop that was carrying that farm. So cattle and forage kind of got harvested, when there was extra time. Older, poorly maintained equipment, and I understand why people don't buy new equipment. I grew up on a farm in Northeast Ohio. We never had new equipment. In fact, I never even knew that they made new equipment. Our equipment was so old, and that can lead to delays when it malfunctions, and we can't get the forage harvested on time. And then we have poor curing conditions, and this is probably one of the biggest factors. We combine poor curing conditions in the spring when we really need to be in May. We really need to be in that field harvesting that forage. and combine that with a heavy crop at that first cutting, and it just delays when we can harvest forage. So this was kind of an interesting graph. Matthew Dixon at our UK Ag Weather Center put this together several years ago, and what it shows is the top 10 wettest years on record from 1895 to 2020. And what this graph shows is that 5 of those 10 years have occurred since 2011. Pretty interesting. And that data is kind of confirmed by this map that shows the average annual precipitation in the eastern United States is increasing. If you look at eastern Kentucky, here you'll see that it has increased from 2 to 4 inches of rainfall on average from 1991 to 20. When we look at 1981 to 2010 and 1991 to 2020. So we're seeing increasing trends of rainfall in the humid eastern United States. So this has been resulting in a decrease in the number of baling days. So if I look at May, when I really need to be in the field cutting that hay, we're losing anywhere between 1.2 and 2 baling days in the month of May. And you're saying, well, that's only a baling day and a half in eastern Kentucky. Well, when you only start with 5.5 baling days, that's a significant decrease in a baling day. A baling day is 3 curing days, so 3 good days to dry that hay out, followed by a 4th day on which we can bale it. And in the month of May, we're down to about 4 baling days in the Lexington location. So the question is how do we manage for high quality hay when we have even fewer baling days and more rainfall? More rainfall is good in that we're going to produce more dry matter, but it's going to be harder to get it cured. And the answer is obvious, right? We need to shorten the period between when we cut that hay and when we get it into a bale. So we do that 2 ways. We can either do things to speed up curing, so that would be using a conditioning system on our baler, on our mower to break the stems so that moisture can escape faster. We ted the hay to help bring the green material up and let that moisture escape. We make our mower swath wider so that we have a wider area exposed to solar radiation to help get that crop cured. Or we bale at a higher moisture. And really, we've been seeing an increase in the use of baleage in the transition zone. So that's when we bale at a higher moisture, and then we wrap that hay with a plastic film, and then that hay goes through a fermentation. And what this does is it allows us to cut one day and bale the next day and wrap that forage. And that shortens that period between cutting and baling. And the real power of baleage is that it allows us to harvest that crop at the correct growth stage. So we're not waiting for that 4-day period to get that hay cured out, that first cutting of hay cured out. It's allowing us to cut at the late boot or early head stage, and that's going to significantly increase forage quality. So a lot of farmers are using baleage as a rain management tool. And what I mean by that is that normally we tell people that when your hay that you're trying to get dried down is between 20 and 40% moisture, that's kind of a no man's land. Neither silage or dry hay will successfully you can successfully store that hay. We're seeing a lot of producers wrapping what I would say is almost dry hay, so not quite dry enough to bale, but not in the moisture range that we'd want it to be for silage. So it's kind of almost dry hay, and they're referring to it as sweet hay. And they're using this as a rain management tool. And I've seen producers use this. One of the biggest ones that I've met was a guy in Northeast Ohio, and he's baling hay for sale to dairies. And he's using this baleage as a rain management tool. So he's actively wrapping almost dry hay and selling it as high quality forage for dairies. So we did a study a couple years ago. I had a summer intern, and they evaluated the moisture content at ensiling on the pH and nutritive value. And we went into a hay field of tall fescue, and we started to sample. I say we, but my student. As soon as we cut it, and it was at 20%, was at 80% moisture as soon as we cut it, and then it dried down to 20%, which was when it was baled for dry hay. So essentially, we started as soon as that plant was cut and harvested and took a sample every several hours and assiled that sample. And we did this all the way until it was dry enough to bale for hay. And then we evaluated the impact of moisture on the pH and the nutritive value of that ensiled forage. So this is what we found. So that as that hay, and this is dry matter and ensiling, as that hay got drier, and this is when we would start to harvest about 80% for dry hay, and this is the optimal zone for ensiling, so 55 to 65% moisture. This is what happened to pH. So as the moisture decreased, or as that silage got higher, we went through less of a fermentation. So we were up here around a pH of 6 when we were ready to harvest for hay. In the ideal range, we were in that pH range of 5 to about 5.5. And that's exactly where we'd want to be for ideal fermentation for our grass hay. So as that hay dried, the fermentation became less. And the question is what impact does that have on forage quality? And what I want to show you here is the impact on total digestible nutrients. So that's that estimation of hay. And as you can see, as that hay dried out and we ensiled it, it had very little impact on either crude protein or total digestible nutrients. So that line is almost flat. So as long as we excluded the oxygen from that forage, even if it was not in the ideal range for ensiling, we still were able to successfully preserve that hay. And that's what these producers are doing that are wrapping almost dry hay or making sweet hay. The key to making that work is excluding that oxygen from the system. So that means you have to get plenty of plastic on that bale to make sure that we don't have any oxygen in the system. Now, where this kind of falls a little bit short at is that the aerobic stability of those bales are less. So if I'm feeding out in the wintertime, I only want to put enough bales out for 1 or 2 days at a time because the aerobic stability tends to be less. If I'm feeding in the winter, the temperatures are cooler, we tend to get less degradation of the forage, even as it's sitting out. Okay, so the take-home points for tonight is one is you can't manage hay quality unless you're measuring it. And that's exactly what Rebecca has done with this hay contest in your county. She's helping you measure hay quality so that you can understand what you can do to improve that quality that you have. Sustainable hay production systems require a well-designed soil fertility program, and that's in order to keep biomass yield up, keep desirable forage species in your stand, so desirable grasses and desirable legumes in your stand, and keep crude protein up in some cases. The single most important factor impacting forage quality is stage of maturity at harvest. So it's really important that we get in there and get that first harvest made in a timely manner. If we can do that, we're going to have the greatest impact on the forage quality that we're producing, of the hay we're producing. Weather trends in the eastern United States are tending to favor higher rainfall and fewer baling days, and that is making bale silage a good option for shortening that period up between when we cut it and when we bale it, allowing us to make hay at the correct stage of maturity. And then I'll just end with this. This is a QR code that'll take you to our forages webpage. And you're always welcome to call me, but I encourage you to use Rebecca. You guys have a great extension agent in your county, and make sure and make the most possible use of her. She can answer most of your questions. And if she can't, she can get with me and I'll be happy to help answer the question.